Hello, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Government Summit COVID-19 and Government webinar series. Today, we welcome you to a great session, Post-COVID-19, How Data Will Shape Resilient and Agile Financial Ecosystem. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Axel Threlfall, Editor-at-Large from Reuters.
Thank you very much indeed, Reem. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. I am honored to be hosting this extremely important discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, please allow me a few brief words to set the scene. We are all only too aware of the far-reaching impacts the pandemic and efforts to control it have had, the tragic loss of life, the loss of livelihood for many, the enormous impact on economies around the world. In fact, just this morning, the OECD added its damage projections to the many already outlined by the World Bank and the IMF, among others. In no uncertain terms, it said the global economy will suffer the biggest peacetime downturn in a century before it emerges next year from a coronavirus-inflicted recession. Data, of course, will play a critical role in how effectively governments, businesses, and individuals navigate this context. Key will be how each leverages the sheer breadth and depth of data available to build more resilient, more agile systems and find the means with which to manage the challenges ahead. Now, I mention the breadth and depth of data available. Of course, before we even begin to interpret the data in front of us, it is important to understand exactly what is available for interpretation. I don't want to steal our speaker's thunder here, but it is fascinating to see what governments and businesses are seeking out to help them understand and navigate this uncharted context. Underneath all of the obvious fundamental data are reams of indicators on pretty much anything we can think of, what some are calling the alt data. I'm not sure if any of you saw the recent Harvard Medical School study, which, by the way, has been dismissed by Beijing. It was of hospital traffic and search engine data that suggested the new coronavirus may already have been spreading in China last August. The study used satellite imagery of hospital parking lots in Wuhan and data for symptom-related queries on search engines to reach its conclusions. Then, of course, there is the issue of quality, just how comprehensive, trustworthy, and timely is the data being used. Because, of course, that will determine how effectively, how efficiently governments and societies everywhere are able to respond to crises. So lots to talk about. Let me introduce our speakers. David Craig is the CEO of Refinitiv, the leading data provider. He was previously the president of Thomson Reuters Financial and Risk business. He was also recently a member of the World Economic Forum's Digital Disruption Innovation Group on digital identities and federated ledgers. I'd also like to welcome Saeed AlAwar, Managing Director and Head of Middle East of Rothschild, of course, one of the world's leading investment banks. During his career, he oversaw the ongoing $55 billion transfer of assets from Abu Dhabi Power to TAQA, the disposal of Greenland to Group Lactalis for Americana Group, among many other different deals. Before Rothschilds, he was a lawyer with Linklaters both in the UAE and the London offices. So welcome to both of you. Let me kick it off, though, with you, David, if I may. There's probably never been a crisis in peacetime that's been so all-encompassing. How does the data that you are seeing bear that out?
Well, and thank you, Axel, and thank you, World Government Summit, for inviting us to talk today. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. It's a real pleasure to talk. And first, may I just say, look, I hope everyone's safe. This is a tragedy and a crisis of multiple dimensions. and is having an extraordinary effect both on our lives, our livelihoods, our health, and our economic situation. And so clearly for a company like us, we wake up in the morning and we deliver billions and billions of data points around the world. 190 countries is where we deliver to on a 24/7 basis. And we've seen extraordinary both increase, tripling in the supply of data, but also the demand for data as people try and understand what exactly is happening and try and create a crystal ball to predict what might happen and how to understand, how to react to that. So it's an extraordinary event that is happening in front of us. It's unprecedented, but I think it's also important to remember that several crises are happening at the same time. First and foremost, this has been started by a crisis in health, and the pandemic is going around the world and affecting people because there is no cure or real treatment at the moment. Now, my first slide, actually, just to visualize some of the data, is probably the most tracked data graph in all time, showing the number of cases by country over time. People are fascinated and obsessed with looking at that curve and the shape of the curve. They're peering into how is the data created? How do you normalize across countries? There's lots of discussion now about how exactly do you measure a case, how transparent are governments about declaring the number of cases. And in fact, of course, the number of cases is dependent on the amount of testing. So like any of these data sets, it's only as good as the input of how you can interpret it. But what we found by putting this data set onto our platforms, it's probably the most read data set that we have right now, because it is probably the most valuable leading indicator of what is actually happening in the world. But it's also important to remember, of course, that a healthcare crisis has created a social and economic crisis. And another data set that we look at very carefully with our clients is, for example, US jobless claims. This chart, I think, an extraordinary chart, just shows in unprecedented way how severe this crisis is, with the jump in US jobless claims that you're seeing this year. Nothing else has been seen like this before since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. You'd have to go back to the Great Depression to see that. But then, of course, the crisis doesn't stop there. We've also had an oil, an energy, and a commodities crisis, and particularly for the Middle East, this is very important. But for any country that is a net producer of commodities, this is creating another crisis in itself. And just look at the price decline of oil through the crisis. Again, unprecedented fall. And so we're seeing a health crisis, an economic crisis, a commodities and oil crisis. And to give you an idea of, sort of the volatility of this and how this is affecting markets, just look at oil and equity volatility and the degree in which that you've seen an explosion in the demand to really understand what is this data set looking like? How do I predict my way through this volatility track? How do I invest when this is happening or not invest? How do I trade when this is happening? Or how do I, as a government, get confidence that I understand my core financials of my government system and how they're working? And this is why we've seen up to 40, 50, 60% demand for the amount of data every single day, be it through the desktop, be it the machines we serve, the black boxes, through others. We've seen new records not just broken, but slash. On average, we're now running at about 150 billion data updates a day. That is more than twice the previous record that we saw of data updates that are happening through the system. We're seeing 3 times the volume of data. We're seeing at least twice the demand for data. And so governments, companies, everyone is trying to pore over this to get a view. And as you said, Axel, is the data clean? Can I trust it? How do I know where it's come from? And all those questions are being asked.
Yeah, let me ask you, let me jump in, David. I mean, you touched on what the crisis has meant for demand of data. I mean, clearly there's a huge spike here. What about the kinds of data that your customers want? I mentioned also alt data, and I know you're going to come on to that, but what sort of data are they looking for right now?
Well, we've actually one of the things we've done in a very agile, responsive way is look at the patterns of not just the data but the consumption of data, and we call it the data on the data. What are people reading literally on an hourly basis? What are they looking up? What are they downloading? So, for example, we've seen demand for data in the equity sectors that have been impacted most: airlines, leisure, increased by twice, but we've seen the demand for the data for the sectors that are less impacted, like the technology platforms, also increase to do it. And interestingly enough, we look at it by topic, and graph I'll show now is this is very recent now, just looking at the percentage increase in retrievals versus an average over 2019. And almost a 500% increase, no surprise, in the news and information around human diseases and conditions. Everyone wants to know if there's going to be a vaccine. And you're seeing price movements on vaccine news and trial news. Interestingly, though, look at violent crime, race relations. That's a factor of what happened with George Floyd murder last week in the US, and now this becoming a very important issue that people want to understand. Insolvency, liquidation and bankruptcy, major political news. So actually, by looking at this on a very regular basis, we can really try and understand, well, what are the patterns of usage, what are people focusing on, and therefore how can we supply better data to meet that need.
And something you and I have often talked about is ESG being back in fashion. I mean, it seems to me that there is a huge, I mean, you talked about an environmental crisis at the beginning, but I imagine demand for the ESG data and anything on ESG is now back in vogue.
Well, I mean, those of us who were at the World Economic Forum in January remember that the topic that everyone was focused on was the planet and sustainable finance, and how finance could find a way of helping to fund the transition, and how we could move away from the high carbon intensive industries to lower carbon areas. I think what's been really fascinating, and all of that was before the crisis, what has been really fascinating, of course, and there's been many studies produced on this, including ours, is through the crisis, the equities and the funds with a higher ESG scoring have performed less worse, call it better, than the equities and funds with lower ESG scores, even if you take into account the effect of oil price on that. What we have seen, though, through the crisis is up to a 50% increase in the demand for ESG data. And why is that? What we've asked ourselves, what's going on? So I think not only has it been recognized that these companies and funds have performed better, but also that many people are looking at, if I'm rebalancing my portfolio, if I'm an asset manager or even a wealth advisor, how do I move away from some of the things that have high carbon intensity and avoid those kind of stranded assets, and move towards the areas, and use this to move towards the areas which have better ESG scores, are better governed, and have a better emissions footprint. But fascinating data.
Saeed, I do want to bring you in. Just before I do bring you in, Saeed, it's something I should have mentioned at the top. To our viewers and the audience, please do message your questions in, because we're going to leave at least 20 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. So I just wanted to remind you to send your questions through, and we'll get those to our speakers. Saeed, I know you had some views on ESG yourself.
Yes, so I mean, I think to reiterate what the data shows, and to talk more about from a global investment perspective, but also from a regional perspective, the ESG agenda has been quite important. The providers of capital have made ESG a focus. We've seen banks in Europe where activist investors have come in and are enforcing and are asking boards to endorse the ESG agenda, where essentially capital is slightly drying up for those that are not ESG compliant. The coronavirus crisis has actually fast-tracked the importance of this as well for oil-producing nations in the region. And it is ever becoming important for the providers of capital out of the region, so the sovereign wealth funds, but also the corporates that sit here realize that if they need capital, whether regionally or internationally, then they will also need to respect that as well. But that's the comment that I'd like to make.
Okay, good. Look, we've talked, quite a bit in the first 15 minutes about the financial markets, David, and you mentioned the corporates just now, as did David. I want to ask you both this question, starting with you, David. clearly data drives the financial markets, but what lessons should government and civil society take from all of this? And we'll get into what they're doing right and what they're not doing right in just a second. But what sort of lessons should be learned, David?
Well, I think that some of the lessons from the crisis is that pandemics ignore borders, financial markets to a large degree ignore borders, and data to a large degree ignores borders. And I think that government in particular needs to start using data from not just their own markets and environments that they have access to, but global markets too, because they have to understand the impact that is happening outside the region or the country. And what that could do inside the country. And I think the hyper-connected world that we live in has demonstrated actually that the more you can access that data that is available around the world and do it in a trusted way, sometimes when the data isn't that clean, you have to make interpretations of it. But to create that muscle and that capability is now a real priority. I think this crisis is being very discriminatory, and it will discriminate against those that are equipped with data and information versus those who are not. And I think the other thing too is that you're seeing it now. I don't want to call out the countries, but the countries that are producing less transparent data on what's going on are reducing trust. And if you take case tracking, for example, of cases, as trust falls away, then investors fall away. And I think trust and data now is incredibly linked and very, very strongly linked. And the two have to go hand in hand. So there's both a need to be transparent about what is happening, but also be able to collect, interpret, and manage the data from other sources as well as a government is the imperative.
All right. Well, look, there's clearly a lot of data that governments already use and indeed produce. There's the other stuff, the alt data that I mentioned at the beginning, and I want to come on to that in a second. But Saeed, I want to get your headline thoughts on the way governments in general are engaging here. I mean, you advise governments on fiscal policy. What is your headline thought on governments in the region that you cover and the way they are gaining access to the data that matters and then using that in a clever fashion?
So I think what's happened, as David even indicated previously, we've had a crisis, twofold crisis. We've had the oil price impact and the COVID-19 impact. And I don't think in recent history we have experienced in the MENA region a crisis of this nature. So there's been a significant impact on fiscal balances for, I would say, all producing nations. And if you take this more home in the Middle East region, obviously it has had a direct impact. And the question now becomes it's such a pivotal moment in history for the governments in the region and all producing nations globally to think about how do we define our economies and our fiscal budgets going forward. And what is key and what is fundamental is the availability of data to make those decisions. And what we generally see, and this is not specific to a specific country, but more a global perspective, is that the availability of data is the biggest hurdle for governments to really make the right decision. And I think in the region, people have made huge improvements on availability of data, but we are still way behind. And we can talk about, I mean, maybe perhaps a bit later, about what does that mean for these economies? Because as governments are less able to invest and government investments become a smaller part of the overall economy, how do we incentivize private investments to come in through the availability of data? Yeah.
I mean, you say, Saeed, what does it mean? What's the implication? But my question before that is, how do we change the issue of data availability? How do we improve the issue of data availability? What can be done?
So I think there's a lot of things that you could do. I think if we start from a regulatory perspective, we look at simple things like our equities markets in the region. The availability, the level of depth of reporting that is available in these markets does not enable you at all times. I think different companies have different practices, but there's no consistency to the availability of data, even with listed companies. And so to the extent you can have more in-depth information about these businesses' performance, why they haven't performed so well, in order for investors to make a decision, whether local, regional, or international, to make a decision of whether we should invest capital into these corporates, into these companies, into these projects, it makes things easier. The other point I would say is I think governments need to be better at disclosing data more broadly about the activity within the economy. So I think we have, in the UK, you have registrars of companies that are quite public. You can log on, find data about any company you want, what their accounts are. In this part of the world, you can't do it without the consent of the owners. Now, there are pros and cons, and I'm sure there are debates around it, but there's definitely the point around making more data available is fundamental. And that's why you see a correlation between, I would say, the Western developed economies, the amount of investment that is going into them versus other parts of the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Open, and data is definitely more available.
All right, all right. I want to take a step back and come back to you, David. But just before I do that, just a reminder to everyone listening in, everyone watching, if you've got questions for David or Saeed, do send them through, and I'll make sure I put those to our speakers. David, so just stepping back, I mentioned this idea of alt data, alternative data in my introduction. There's clearly a lot of data governments already use, a lot of the fundamental stuff, a lot of the obvious macro stuff. Give us an idea from the sort of the sort of information that you collect at Refinitiv, what this other more timely perhaps or real-time alt data looks like, and what's most popular and what's being used.
Well, I agree with Saeed. I'd just like to build on some of his points there about disclosures. In the disclosures do need to get better, but in a way they're very retrospective. They're a rear view mirror, and having a rear view mirror, it helps you drive. It means that you know what's behind you. But actually, one of the exciting things about what people call alternative data is it tells you what's coming. It's what's ahead of you. And that's why the private equity firms, the private investors and others in particular have created this surge around alt data. I sometimes think though that, our history, we're a 2-year-old company with 160 years history, but we've been doing alternative data for 160 years because what tends to be alternative today will become mainstream tomorrow as people actually find a way of collecting it in a more standard way. I think part of the revolution that's happening around alternative data now is the Internet of Things and mobile devices and the way that you can actually gather information on human and machine activity, and also satellite data, which is now becoming a far quicker and easier way, basically to ignore the regulatory and governmental constraints sometimes of what you can see and take it from space. And I just want to show a slide actually just to illustrate one of the examples, and this actually has been available for a few years, but this is last night. This is 9 o'clock of shipping movement through the Gulf, of all of the ships by type, and what are they carrying. We've got the movement of the ship, we know what's on them and who owns them and where they've been and where they're coming from. And you can suddenly understand quickly, you could ask all these companies to fill in a form and declare where their ships are and how laden they are and where they're going to. And believe me, they all do that. How long would it take to get that information through the system versus using this as a combination of satellites and transceivers? It's real time, and it tells you automatically what's the flow of oil, bulk, and other commodities through the Gulf, and you can do this from any other parts of the world. And you've got an incredibly powerful real-time way of not just looking in the backward mirror, but actually looking in the forward mirror about economic activity. So through the crisis, for example, we were tracking the number of ships off Singapore that were empty because there was no oil to fill them. Well, now actually with an oil surplus, they're filled up, but they're not moving. So these are the types of indicators that you're seeing. One thing that really struck me was we've been looking very heavily at satellite data for carbon and carbon equivalent emissions for the use of ESG, but suddenly this became an economic indicator because guess what? The amount of CO2 that you can now measure on literally a 50 to 100 meter basis that's been emitted from a city is a very, very accurate indicator of economic activity in the city. And is it coming back? Is lockdown finished and other things? And so these are relatively, shipping movement is not bleeding edge. That's pretty mainstream, but satellite imagery of CO2 and emissions and others is relatively bleeding edge. And I think it's a question of basically keeping up. We have to keep pushing the boundaries of what data is available. I completely agree on disclosures. and that builds trust and understanding. What the markets are moving to, though, too, is saying, look, we're not going to wait for the rear view mirror. We actually want to get better insight into economic activity through these alternative data sets as well.
Okay, and look, and questions are coming in now, and I am going to, if they're relevant to what's being said, I'm going to come straight to them. And this one is: do you think, David, and I'll ask the same to Saeed, do you think that these data trends that we've been talking about, particularly the surge in demand for old data, are here to stay?
Yes, and I think they're going to become more mainstream, as I said. I think the term is a rather strange term because it sort of suggests this is some kind of alternative, and actually what it is just smart, real-time interactive data that's looking at, say, a car park or mobile phone usage or sentiment analysis or other areas, and basically deriving analytics and insights from data. So I absolutely think it's here to stay.
Because it's sometimes so left field, though, and so wacky, for want of a better word. How can we trust it all the time and have the confidence and make decisions based on it?
Well, you need trusted sources and you need trusted providers, and you need to also get various sources and correlate between them. And this is where, you're not just going to look at data and get the answer out of a box. You've got to actually have some skill sets of interpretation to understand the provenance. Just because I've got CO2 emissions of a city, does that really mean that's the economic indicator of the city, or could be something else going on? Is it a public holiday? It does take time and intelligence to figure this through, and there needs to be trusted data providers that can do that in the market and bring that data in a usable fashion as well. And don't forget, there will always be a group of people who are trying to get the alternative data that no one else can get. So you've got a market that is basically more standardized, and you've got a market for true exceptional and alternative data that they will want to get that data hidden edge that other people can't get.
Saeed, to you, and bringing governments back into it, and this is another question from a viewer, whether you think governments are using the correct data to come out of lockdown in particular. I mean, yes, you've talked about availability of the right data, and maybe a lot of this old data is what you're talking about. But what about specifically coming out of lockdown and the use by governments of the right data to exit lockdown?
Look, I think as David said, what governments can only do is make use of the most available data they have and cross-check with other sources. I mean, you're talking about a situation that evolves by the day. And so I think we have to be a bit humane in all of this as well, and give people a break, because it's not as easy and as simple as we may think. It's an evolving situation. There's a lot of sources of data. There's Chinese data, there's US data. Which one do you take? And people will have views. I'm not an expert in the field, so I wouldn't profess to know this. But if you take examples of even corporates, and just talking about the point that you mentioned before on alternative data, the leading corporates around the world, whether it's an Amazon or Google or the leading agricultural traders around the world, the reason why they are the leaders is because they have edge on information and data. They know what's about to happen. They have the pulse of the market, and pulse of the market means data. And so, that's why I would completely agree with David. This is here to stay, and the more there is available, there will be more competition, and you'd put these corporates that are trying to grow at not an equal footing, but at a more equal footing with their competition.
Are we moving? Sorry, David, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to the last financial crisis, a different crisis of severe proportions, but not as severe as this, but the last financial crisis, I remember talking to regulators who are still receiving financial information on fax machines. So I do think we've moved a long way in many areas of the world. One thing I keep noticing when I work with governments is actually many government departments have more data than they realize. The one thing that is important to remember about data is before you go and look outside for all the other sets, actually look at the data that you have yourself, and are you putting it to use in the right way? And often some of the challenges is actually sharing data into government and between departments can be as challenging as getting data from outside the world. And whilst, yes, there's lots of alternative data out there, and it looks very attractive and sexy, understanding what data sets you already have if you're a corporation or a government is really important. Some of the most valuable data we have as a company, of course, is our own data sets. but I'd encourage people to do that. But I think that we are moving on. We have moved on a long way. I think, as Saeed said, the data is literally moving daily, and the interpretation of the data we're learning as we go along. Just take cases of COVID or deaths of COVID or other really leading indicators. Yeah. How that's measured is very different around the world, and understanding that measurement has become critically important.
And I'll give you an example, Axel, as well. And we, as investment advisors and finance advisors globally, the amount of, and obviously Zoom and these other platforms have helped make this happen. The number and the frequency of discussions we have with corporates, governments, and sovereign wealth funds is more than ever. We used to catch up with people maybe every few months or every couple of months. It's now become weekly because of how evolving the situation is, because of how data is evolving. And thanks to David and his company, we have some sources that we can look at, and then we look at other sources. And so we try to cross-check what's available. And we have to keep, again, as close of a pulse on the market as we can. And I think that's what's happening with governments as well.
Let me ask you, this is also relates to another question that's come through. We talk a lot at the moment in the current context about inward-looking agendas, particularly from certain governments around the world. What does that mean, or what's the danger that data is held close to the chest and there isn't enough transfer or exchange of trustworthy, timely data around the world?
Can I perhaps make a comment, and then I'll about what we see across the region specifically? I mean, when someone doesn't give you enough disclosure or transparency on data, naturally the human reaction is you become a bit suspicious. And I think that I'm making this quite simple because I think what governments need to realize is if you don't disclose, people tend to become more conservative, and they tend to discount, and then they tend to disbelieve. No matter what you say, people will always take the more conservative view. And this is how we do things from an investment perspective. And so even if the data may show some bad things, let's say, I don't think it's the end of the world, because maybe it's not as bad as people may have thought. So disclosure is always, in some ways, better than not disclosing, I think, because at least it's a starting point. And if it's bad, hopefully it won't be worse than that. And I think that's a very generalistic comment, but I think that's something the governments need to start addressing.
Sure, go ahead, David.
I would agree with that. I would say that there is more scrutiny than ever before on what data is produced by government, and you just have to look at I keep going back to the statistics of coronavirus cases or deaths, and there are a couple of countries around the world that are trying to, let's say, not be fully transparent, and they're tripping up on that because as Saeed says, it reduces trust. Then you look at emerging markets and the debt levels they have and how those debt levels are rising. I mean, if the transparency falls down, confidence will go and the debt problem increases. So I think there's multiple places where actually transparency and trust in a country level data is incredibly important at the moment. And in a way, having the bad news out is better than trying to hide the bad news, because trust will be reduced even more.
And I'll give you an example again on all of this, where we have several discussions with investors looking at sectors that are directly impacted by what's going on, whether it's airline and travel, hospitality. And people ask the question, how far is the population decline going to go? Honestly, I have no answer to that. But what the governments could do is if they publish monthly data on population numbers, maybe it's not a full statistic, but at least on leavers or how much people have come in. I think that enables people, it's a data point that people can reflect on and take a view. Because the less steep the data becomes, or if the pace of reduction slows down, you know that we're heading towards the bottom of the cycle, and people can take a view and start investing. So I think data always helps.
Lots of questions coming through, and I do want to get to these. But back to governments and who's getting this right. I know you need to be careful, Saeed, and I know, of course, David, you need to be careful too. But can you give us an example in the region that you focus on, Saeed, of governments making it available, making the data available, of governments sharing the data, and give us examples of the positive impacts of doing that.
So I think let's take an example of a city that has strived to attract foreign direct investment, and that's Abu Dhabi, and they've been investing quite heavily in attracting foreign direct investment on multiple fronts, and Saudi has been trying to do the same. I mean, if you take an example of what ADNOC has been doing with its infrastructure assets, trying to attract the likes of Brookfield, attract the likes of BlackRock, all these large investment funds around the world, you have to disclose a huge amount of data about your gas reserves, about your oil reserves, and what's going through. And so that availability of data to these investors makes the investment possible. Again, the same with Saudi. Saudi had the Saudi Aramco IPO, huge amount of disclosure that has always been very secretive, right? Let's not comment about valuation, etc., but let's talk about disclosure. Disclosures made it possible for investors to even look at it. People may disagree on how valuable that asset is, but at the end of the day, people are taking a look, which means they're interested in taking a look. So I think those are just quite anecdotal examples of how they've been successful. I think there's more and more that needs to happen for this to become a more open platform, I have to say. It's still quite difficult for the likes of the global private equities who have huge amounts of capital to easily navigate the region and say which is a good asset and which isn't. That's why you see most of their interactions happen at the moment with a lot of the GREs, or what we call government entities. But those are hopefully helpful examples.
Yeah. Okay. Very, very helpful. Thank you for that. But But before we come to some of these questions, what can you go to governments with and say, look, this is what happens if you don't get on board? Can you say to governments, look, you will find it increasingly difficult to manage and to regulate the behavior of markets, for example, if you don't provide the sort of data that the market needs and wants? I mean, does that sort of pressure make any difference in your line of work, Saeed?
I think what people, it's more human behavior, right? So I think wherever we are around the world, I think what drives human behavior is need to do something. And I think the good thing about the COVID-19 crisis really is it's a sense of maturity. It's a wake-up call for all of us in this region to realize that the wealth of oil may be around for some time, but it's not going to be around forever. That we need to be ready for shocks as big as the coronavirus. We need to make these changes very quickly. And I think this wake-up call has helped bring in a lot of change. You see the Saudis announcing very difficult decisions about raising VAT, and those are difficult decisions, and they understand that because of that, I mean, consequentially, they will need to start releasing a bit more data about where they spend the money. And I think the UAE will, may follow. I mean, you hear a lot of debates around it, so they may follow something around that, and I think they've already taken a lot of steps, and hopefully other countries in the region realize this. And if they don't, I mean, it's a tough call for them as well.
Sure. David, getting to some of the questions, a question comes through about the future mix of alt data versus fundamental data. What does that mix look like? Is there a danger that fundamental data becomes almost irrelevant? Looking at the asks, the demands from your clients, I mean, do you see a massive push towards alt data away from fundamental?
Well, I think fundamental is changing. To my point about what is alternative today becomes fundamental tomorrow as it becomes mainstream. And so, you know, I remember when certain news stories about company news releases was seen as breaking news. Well, now for a public company, it's almost like that's just standard data, because rarely are there major shocks in news releases from companies. You've seen something that used to become a little bit alternative and difficult to get as now mainstream. I think fundamental data is changing. Our ESG data is grouped with the fundamental data of our companies because it's seen as just part of fundamental data through that, whereas a few years ago that probably would have been classed as alternative because it was more difficult to get. So I think that whilst the the attention looks like it's all going into the alternative data. In fact, what's happening is the boundary between alternative and fundamental is shifting. And by fundamental, I mean fundamental on an economy or a company or a debt instrument or a fund or all those areas. And so you just have to keep expanding what is fundamental in your base versus how do you find the alternative, quote unquote, data that can give you that more forward-looking insight of what's happening. There is definitely a lot of attention and focus on what is seen as alternative. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen this go very, very high indeed. And it does come from the investor community. As Saeed said, in absence of other better data sources, how do I get a unique edge by understanding some of the data sets that tell me something about that company or that investment that we wanted to make? I mean, a great example at the moment, we have a global infrastructure database of infrastructure projects. Infrastructure will be a big response to this crisis. There'll be investment in new infrastructure projects. The world needs trillions of new infrastructure in any case. And I think a lot of the response will be that. And what we're seeing now, and there's a lot further to go, is governments actually raising the standards of the transparency and the disclosures about these major projects. And that's a really good thing, because actually what we have at the moment is we have more investors saying we want to invest in these, but we just don't trust them. We don't have enough data. We think there's sort of backroom things happening. How can you, Refinitiv, help us get more transparency on these projects? So we're working hard with various bodies around the world just to bring better standards to that. And in a way, that might, ruin some of the chances of alternative data, but if we bring that more mainstream, I think that's actually a good thing.
And okay, yeah, sorry, Saeed.
I was going to comment on a point. I mean, the accuracy of data, as David was saying, is such an important point. And I mean, just to give you an example of what's happened recently, people in the region may know, people in London may hear about the NMC case, which is a case that has, honestly, has hit investor public confidence on transparency and governance of companies. And it is London listed. It is a UAE-based company, so it has effects on Middle Eastern-based businesses as well. And the question there, and you asked about government role and what they should do about data. It's not only about the government data, where the government role lies. The other role of governments is to ensure there's enough data out there, and that the data that is out there is accurate enough to protect investors' investments in the first place. And what has happened there is catastrophic. There are claims and allegations of fraud, and investors have probably lost all of their money because they couldn't have enough accurate data to track what's happened, to ensure that their investment is safe. And unfortunately, all of this has unfolded when it was too late. So just an example of how governments should also play a role in disclosures and ensuring that what data is available is accurate to protect investment, not only to attract investments.
Yeah, and I was trying to find a question that I saw pop by, and I will try and find it in a moment. But how do you worry? And Rothschild's a fairly traditional investment bank. Is there a cynicism, do you think, by some within the organization and of course among some of your more traditional clients towards this old data? And how, to what extent do you worry about a backlash? When untrustworthy old data is used by a high profile entity and it sets everyone back years?
Look, I mean, it's a very, you're hitting a very sensitive point. Whenever we talk about now disclosures of Middle Eastern businesses, this question comes up and people ask, is this data reliable? Can I even rely that your profitability, let's say, is 100 and it's not 0? So this question is coming up, and we need to, as an institution, apply an even higher level of discipline and diligence on the assets. And the other edge I think we have to play here is ensuring, I mean, and this is something that I'm sure David and his team to some extent do, is check the sources of this data. I mean, in companies, it's owners of companies that are the sources or the custodians of data. So in some ways, we need to be comfortable with those custodians. And we need to find information and data about them. And that's what puts you at an edge, because depending on your relationships and what you know, some of that data may not be publicly available. So it's not an easy answer. Maybe that doesn't answer your question directly, but
well, I guess I wonder, say, just how much cynicism there is out there among, within organizations like your own, but also among government clients when you're talking about fiscal policy, etc.
Look, I think with governments, I don't think there's any doubt that the government data I would say, in the countries that have strong credit ratings, there's any question about them. And I think they go through such a rigorous process that they are investment grade for a reason. So I'm less concerned about those countries. I think countries where their credit ratings are worse, they will need to find ways to support themselves, whether it's through transparency, but it will be a long process, not only about data that brings ratings to the right level. So look, I don't think this has attracted issues with government entities necessarily, but in a more broader context, whether the companies are government owned or whether they are privately owned, this cynicism exists. And I think generally speaking, we just need to be more disciplined in how we, and the level of diligence that we need to apply in what a broader sense has to be at a higher level. And I would add as well that governance, which is not a topic of discussion today, is something that helps manage accuracy of data.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just come in, Axel, I mean, 2 points. When I go back to what I said earlier about the companies and the funds with higher ESG scores, have weathered the crisis so far better than those with lower. Part of that was their degree of carbon exposure and not. Part of that was around governance, the G in ESG, is they tend to be better managed. And if you're better managed, you're more transparent, you have better disclosure. So there's a number of factors that I think explain some of those reasons why those companies with the higher scores, and they tend to be the more modern, more technology-based companies, have actually fared better. I also want to just go slightly to the left of what Saeed was saying, was also talk about not just how the companies operate, but actually how media and information works in general. And the ability for media and news to report, but also now social media plays a really important role. I just want to give the last example of a data set, if I could, which shows the importance of social media sentiment. If we just flash up slide 8, if you can, because this has actually become a very strong and important investment tool. What this shows is the United States US stock price index versus what we have is a fear index based on social media. And what you see in the red areas is where fear is exceeding the average. So you see extreme areas of fear on social media, and guess what, of course, the correlation with share price movements is extremely high. So one of the things that you can do with alternative data is not necessarily just get the binary ones and zeros of precise data points, but you should actually build up pictures using sentiment and other factors. You can do this on a currency, you can do this on a company, you can use other media sources as well to also start building up a picture of what is happening around a company. And more of our clients are actually putting this to use in trading and investing as well. The challenge is, though, of course, you have to do it in an area or a subject where there's quite a lot of disclosure, there's a lot of public media and public commentary on that. So I just thought I'd show a different angle to the data solution around alternative that can help here.
All right, thank you, David. I'm keeping a wary eye on the clock, but a couple of other bits and pieces here. A question flashed through, but I can't find it anymore. But I think it referred to, and apologies if I've got this wrong or if this is a naive question, but is there such a thing as a data transparency index? I mean, is there a way for governments, for businesses, for individuals, for retail investors to look at data and assess its trustworthiness and its viability?
I mean, there are indexes published on various countries around data transparency. They tend to focus on the media and freedom of press as well as the data transparency and governance and disclosures. So yes, those are available and actually in the public domain, so they can be put to use.
Saeed, I don't know if you want to say anything on the transparency, a data transparency index. Is it something you've heard about?
No, I think I'm not an expert when it comes to those things.
I will leave that. Okay, this is more for you. Do you believe that your region, has gained specific opportunities from the pandemic that's going to allow it to build sustainable financial ecosystems, which of course are mentioned in the title of this discussion?
I think what this crisis has enabled is and this is what I would hope, is the right mindset to enable change to happen. I think moving countries is not an easy thing. I think we have leadership in the region that is quite determined to make change in a positive manner, and it's not always easy. And I think what we need to do, what countries in the region need to do, is use the change in mindset, the willingness to adapt to the changing realities as an opportunity to bring, at the government level, people aligned, information gathering easier. As David said, politics sometimes gets in the way. Silo mentality prevents information from being shared. We see that sometimes, many times. And I think that becomes a big hurdle for governments to make the right decision. And so I do think it's an opportunity to make a lot out of it. And the question, and I think the months and the few years coming ahead will show us whether they've done that or not.
Okay, and actually, a question that's obviously trying to take advantage of the specific hat that you wear. When it comes to investments for regional sustainability, which sectors do you think will be the best sectors for oil-dependent countries to tap into? I know we're getting a little bit away from the data here, but give us your thoughts on that very quickly.
I think what people need to focus on are sectors that are vital to the region, and these are defensive sectors that investors are quite keen on investing behind. And this is education, healthcare, consumer sector, the infrastructure sector. I mean, we have a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. And you look at Saudi, it's an enormous country. It's almost a continent on its own, a large population. It requires a huge amount of infrastructure investment. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to think about what to do there. And then the last piece, and I think this is where it's the frontier piece, is how do we generate energy for us? Renewable is a huge sector, and all of the sustainability related sectors of recycling, renewables, and understanding how we can sustain food. Food requirements in this region is a big question, and water requirements. And I think we have to start addressing those as well. That's more probably for a government to do. But again, I think governments, you'll see governments starting to put initiatives to support investors to make those kind of investments.
Okay. And David, I want to get a final comment from you, if I may, and then we are going to have to wrap it up. I guess I'm sort of stepping back, big picture, what data trends do you predict to see for the rest of this year and 2021 when we look at what's popular now, what's in demand now, the sort of old data out there that you've discussed? What are the big trends that we might see?
Well, I think 15 or so years ago, someone coined the phrase that data will become the new oil. I think in the modern world, data is the new energy, and it's gone from analog to digital. The velocity and frequency, veracity of data is increased 10 times since that first statement was made. We see that every day on everything that we're doing. So I think some of the big trends are the ability for any company to consume, absorb, interpret, and act on the data, to do it in a way that is bridging the silos in their own departments, be they a government or a large corporation, and their ability to interpret that and react on it on a daily basis is going to set winners and losers aside. I think that every company really has to become a data company, and that those who do that really well and do that at scale and do it in an agile way will succeed. And I think the same goes for government as well. I think for governments, the challenge is extraordinarily hard because, of course, the budgets are often smaller to deal with this. But I do think that the ability to share data across department, to share data between countries, I think this conversation around transparency was incredibly important, because actually the more transparent you are, the more investment you'll attract and the more trust that you'll create to do that. So I'm hoping that will improve. I do hope that public disclosures improves. I think on ESG, that is a big part of the equation that is going to help us create a more sustainable world with better healthcare, food supply, and climate control. But I think alternative data is going to play an increasingly important role. The fact that you can beam down on a plant at a 10-meter resolution and understand its CO2 emissions. Frankly, an investor anywhere in the world now can look at a site thousands of miles away and gain more information about that site than possibly people in the site.
Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary change that we're seeing that's going to change the investment strategy, I think, of many companies around the world.
And Saeed, very quickly, is that the message you take to clients, whoever they may be? You cannot afford not to be a data-centric company or entity or organization.
Absolutely. I think that data is important to us as an advisor to a lot of companies and institutions that are in the world. Us being on the edge of data and on the front foot is what makes us different. And so, absolutely, completely agree with what David said.
All right. Look, I want to thank both of you for your time and your insights today, to Saeed and to David. I'm going to hand it back to Reem in just a second, but I want to say as well, as an ambassador of Reuters and the news business, I'm glad that trustworthy news was also mentioned as one of these critical data sets. So thank you very much to all of you. Well, first to our speakers, but to all of you as well for listening in, for watching, and for all of your questions. Let me hand it back to Reem now.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Saeed and David, for joining us today. And it's been a really insightful session. I think we're all going to leave with a lot of things to think about. But one thing I'd love to captivate on is data is the new energy. I think one thing we did take from this session is transparency, agility, are all key things that we need. But unless we don't have them, we're not going to be able to boost this energy, which is data. So I think it's been a really insightful session, and we thank you, Axel, David, Saeed, and everyone for joining us today. Just wanted to thank you all, and also let you, everyone tuned in, to know that we do have a session tomorrow also. So if you'd like to sign up, the link's in the chat box, and it's also on our website. So everyone stay safe, and we hope to speak very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.